Hi guys, I saw this article and I just thought I'd make a video about it. It's from The Atlantic and basically it's for America, but there's so many things that rang true for the UK. So let me just start reading. The baby boomers ruined America. That sounds like a hyperbolic claim, but it's one way to state what I found as I tried to solve a riddle. American society is going through a strange set of shifts. Even as cultural values are in rapid flux, political institutions seem frozen in time. The average US state constitution is much more than 100 years old. We are in the third longest period without constitutional amendment in American history. The longest such period ended in the Civil War. So what's to blame for this institutional aging? One possibility is simply that Americans got older. The average American was 32 years old in 2000 and 37 in 2018. It's no secret that countries like New Zealand, the UK, Canada, America, they're aging populations. The retiree share of the population is booming, while birth rates are plummeting. When a society gets older, its politics change. Older voters have different interests than younger voters, obviously. Cuts to retiree-focused benefits are scarier, while long-term problems such as excessive student debt, climate change, and low birth rates are more easily ignored. But it's not just aging, it's the variety of different areas. The baby boomer generation created, advanced, or preserved politics that made American institutions. In a report for the American Enterprise Institute, it looked at issues including housing, work rules, higher education, law enforcement, and public budgeting, and found a consistent pattern. The political ascendancy of the boomer brought with it tightening controls and stricter regulation, making it harder to succeed in America. This lack of dynamism largely hasn't hurt boomers, but the mistakes of the past are fast becoming the crisis of the younger Americans. I can absolutely sympathize with that. In my lifetime, I have seen nothing but a constant, ever-tightening procession of rules and licenses needed for various. It talks about this in a minute. I'll get to this. Zoning codes in America have their roots in the early 1900s. Some land use rules arose out of efforts to manage growing density in cities due to industrialization and new construction technologies that allowed taller buildings. But most zoning was intended to protect property values. So we don't actually say zoning in the UK, but we do say there is land use. And in fact, I think it's called the Land Use Act. I mean, it's that straightforward. It's like, yes, you bought the property, but don't think you can just do whatever you want with it. I mean, there is some fundamental underlying logic to this, which is you shouldn't build an oil refinery right next to a primary school, obviously. So there should be some basics, but as you'll see in the rest of this article, it's basically saying that the whole thing has got way out of control. Anyway, stricter zoning rules. Most zoning. I'll just start from the beginning. Zoning codes in America have their roots in early 1900s. Some land use rules arose out of efforts to manage growing density in cities due to industrialization and new construction technologies that allowed taller buildings. Yeah, that's the bit we got up to. But most zoning was intended to protect property values for homeowners or to exclude certain racial groups. For many decades, though, zoning codes were relatively limited in scope. We don't so much have a racial issue in the UK as a class issue. I can absolutely see that the upper classes used the laws, of course, to their advantage to exclude poorer people from coming anywhere near their little oasis, as they would imagine it. Stricter zoning rules began to be implemented in many places in the 1940s and 1950s as suburbanization began. But then things got worse in the 1960s to 1980s. This shift is reflected in the increasing frequency with which various land use associated words were used in Google's database of American English language publications. These decades, when the political power of the baby boomer generation was rapidly rising, saw a sharp escalation in land use rules. Yeah, as you can see from the graph, I can't imagine that the graph for the UK would look any different. It's just been a constant onslaught of tighter and tighter rules, to the point where it seems that if they've missed anything, it simply comes down to a question of the default excuse is it affects the character of the area, which translation, we don't want it. That's it. Who defines what is the character of the area? And then you could say, well, it's historical. But so everybody's supposed to be frozen in a certain date. Like everybody's house is supposed to be like a little museum to the 1940s or the 1900s or whenever that particular street was built. The fact that whole streets are built in the UK in one go is a whole other bone of contention. There's a debate about why this is. Some researchers say the end of formal segregation may have pushed some voters to look for informal methods of enforcing segregation. Others suggest that a change in financial returns to different classes of investment caused homeowners to become more protective of their asset values. Today, strict land use rules, whether framed as rules about parking, green space, height limits, neighbourhood aesthetics, what I mentioned, or historical preservation, make new construction difficult. Difficult in the US, nigh on impossible in the UK. In fact, to such an extent that they have to have a TV show with a special government-endorsed stamp of approval kind of thing for it's called The Street, and it's and they literally say at the intro, this has been given like special exemption for lowering the regulations to get what most people watching this would consider normal houses. It's unbelievable. Anyway. Difficult. Even as the American population has doubled since the 1940s, it has gotten more and more legally challenging to build houses. The result is that younger Americans are locked out of suitable housing. And as I've argued previously, I'll give you the name of the author at the end of the end of the video. As I've argued previously, when young people have to rent or live in more crowded housing, they tend to postpone major personal events marking transformations into settled adulthood, such as marriage and childbearing. Although I think there are other factors affecting that as well. But of course, boomers didn't only make rules that nudge young people out of home ownership. They also made new rules restricting young people's employment. Now, it's bad enough that you've got nowhere to live, but when you're so hemmed in by professional licenses that you struggle to make any kind of a decent wage, then it's something has seriously gone wrong when you're struggling to pay rent because of rules. Anyway, laws and rules requiring workers to have special licenses, degrees or certificates to work have proliferated over the past few decades. And while much of this rise came before boomers were politically active, instead of reversing the trend, they have extended it. Yes, this is definitely what you're going to hear from them. Is, oh, these things started before we came to power. Yes, but you've had basically 20 or 30 years to undo them, fix them, sort them. And instead of doing that, you've made them worse. So, shut up. Here's another graph. Percentage of US workers who hold a license for their work. And as you can clearly see, it has risen from 5% or 4% right up to 30% from the 1950s to 2010. So pretty much the era of the boomers. Licensure, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Licensure index. Not quite sure what the difference is between that one and the previous one, but both graphs are going up markedly. So, yeah. Just as tight land use rules make existing homeowners richer by reducing how much new houses are listed on the market, strict licensing rules make existing workers richer by reducing competition in their fields. And while some industries clearly need licensing rules for health and safety reasons, most of the growth in licensure has been in fields where health and safety justifications are less salient. Do we really need hours of coursework and special exams to be a florist or an interior designer or an auctioneer? Of course we don't. By privileging existing workers, licensure, I'm really struggling with that word, rules increase income inequality, and they do so specifically by shifting income towards older workers. When licensure standards exclude felons, they also disproportionately affect minorities. Young people, and especially minorities, are increasingly being legally prohibited from working. Again, scholars differ on explanations for why licensure has proliferated. It could be that work has simply gotten more complex. That's probably true in some areas, but again, you can. It's that small nugget of truth which they use as the foundation for all their bollocks. You see, it's like maybe that's true for 10 or 20% of the cases, but not the rest. Lost my place again. Or it could be that the decline in unions led to a search for new ways to maintain occupational closure. Increased gender and racial integration in workplaces may also have led to a search for new forms of hierarchy. But even for workers who don't need formal license, barriers to work have grown over time. Jobs that once required a high school degree now require a college degree. So that would be, in the UK, jobs that once required a GCSE or GESE or whatever they're calling them these days, now require a degree. This escalation of credential requirements has created a kind of educational arms race. The rise of collegiated attainment? Collegiated. I've never seen that word before. Collegiated attainment, again, did not begin with boomers. Rather, the GI Bill, the explosion in new university charting that it underwrote, created a new norm of college education for many jobs. With the rising ability of higher education, employers who tend to be older than their employees often demand degrees as licenses. Meanwhile, even as higher education gets more expensive, the actual economic returns to a university degree are about flat. Yeah, I read a separate article on this that actually showed investment, how much you put into a degree in time and lost earnings versus what you actually get out, basically balanced out in the end. People who are more educated make more money than people with less education. But overall, most educational groups are just treading water. The social norms requiring degrees for virtually any middle-class job is one largely invented by boomers and their parents, and enforced by those generations. As with formal licensing and land use rules, there are explanations for the rise of degree requirements, greater public support for education, a complex economy, growing demand for knowledge workers. All probably have some validity, but the actual enforcement mechanism for this norm is explicitly generational. Older employers setting standards for younger job applicants. And whatever specific factors contribute to the rise of licensure, land use rules, and demands for more degrees, these developments are part of a wider social trend towards increasing control and regulation across all walks of life, regardless of changes in formal segregation, unionisation, demand for knowledge workers, returns to various asset classes, or other explanations for the rise of work and housing regulations. What is striking is that these trends occur simultaneously and across countries. A graph tracking the rise of paperwork needed to start a new business, or the length of a censor questionnaire, or the length of a federal code, or virtually any method of administrative or regulatory complexity, would show the same basic trend. Sector-specific explanations seem a bit suspect when the trend itself is so general. So, what I get from that is that basically there's always an excuse by your average boomer for why this particular job needs a license, or why this particular street requires so many building codes. It's always an excuse. But when you look across America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, the just about anywhere, you start to see a trend that's not about that specific job or about that specific street. It's just a general trend of control in a downward direction, obviously. Well, not obviously, but anyway. You start to see the bigger picture and you start to go, I'm not having it. I'm not having it. It's too much of a coincidence. Anyway, the most glaring example of this growth in regulation and control is also the easiest one to pin on baby boomers, the incredible rise in incarceration rates. Even though murder rates are today at the same level as they were in the 1950s, the imprisoned share of the population is higher in America than in any other country than North Korea. We imprison a larger share of population than the authoritarian countries such as Turkmenistan and China. At this point, I do have to say, to the best of my knowledge, UK incarceration rates are not spiking, though I could be wrong. I don't really know. Maybe they are, but I would suggest that was a cultural thing. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll just skip this whole section about. It's basically saying the same on crime and incarceration as we've just discussed with licensure and land use and qualification inflation. Incarceration is understandable. Crime waves. Blah 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 blah. Hang on, let's see. Even young people today who are free from prisons are nonetheless in bondage to debt. So we've passed the bit about prisons. Sometimes their own fault, in the form of rapidly growing student loans and personal debt, personal and credit card loans. Anyway, but on a larger scale, the problem of entitlements, pensions, social security, Medicare, federal, state and local debt are becoming more severe all the time. Yeah, we have public health care in the UK, so you can remove the Medicare, but pretty much everything else is the same. Already in places such as Detroit, Illinois, and Puerto Rico, where political rules make flexible solutions hard and the population is aging very quickly, massive debt restructuring looms large. But around the country, the pressures of long-term obligations will grow. Below, I show a reasonable projection of the share of national income that will have to be spent paying for these obligations in the future if there is no substantial restructuring of liabilities. It's based on consensus forecast. Shouldn't that be census? Consensus forecasts from groups such as Congressional Budget Office and Office of Management and Budget for Economic Growth, and for programs such as Social Security and Medicare, where such forecasts are available, and in some cases, such as state debt and pensions, no such forecasts are available, and so I delivered a simple one. As you can see from the graph, it's again just obligations going up and up. Sorry, future payments for debts and obligations going up and up. Making these payments will require fiscal austerity, and who's going to suffer that fiscal austerity? Through either higher taxes or lower alternative spending. Younger Americans will bear the burdens of the baby boomer generation, whether in smaller take-home pay or more potholes and worse schools. Furthermore, the basic demographic balance sheet is getting worse all the time, including the relative burden on young people of working age Americans are dying off at an alarming number. Okay, then it starts to talk about suicides and deaths. Okay, now I'll read it. Okay. The odds of the 32-year-old dying have risen by 24% in the past 5 years, even as death rates among older Americans are about stable. So life's fine for them, even though they're older and they should have more health problems. But your average 30 to 35-year-old, he's now facing 24% chance of death, 24% higher chance of death. Yeah. But of course, while this sudden increase in working age death rates is a new concern, the long-run fiscal crunch has been obvious for decades. For virtually the entire period of the boomer political dominance, it has been obvious that long-term obligations needed to be fixed. And yet, the problem has not been fixed. Younger Americans will suffer the consequences. As dire as this all sounds, there is cause for hope, for the problem is too many senseless rules. Then the solution is obvious. Strict licensure standards can be repealed. Minimum lot sizes can be reduced. Building height ceilings can be raised. Non-violent prisoners can have their sentences commuted. Even thorny problems such as cost control in universities can be addressed through caps on non-instructional spending. Okay. While solutions for government debt and obligations are widely known, even if they are politically unpalatable, not all of these problems were first caused by the boomers, but they each worsened under their watch. If leaders in business, education and politics want to solve these problems, they can. Whether the genontocracy, gerontocracy. Okay, it's like bureaucracy or autocracy, but it's generation-cracy. In charge today want solutions may be another question altogether. Yeah, so there's a huge difference between can't fix it and won't fix it. Why should they fix it? It's benefiting them. Well, because they are human beings first. Well, some barely qualify. Human beings, there is like a basic moral norm that we all understand, which is that if you piss off another group so much that it actually backfires on yourself. Yeah, so the point of this is that they rage about housing crisis in the UK, and yet they won't back down on any of the housing regulations. Like, they do one token gesture for a TV show and they think that's the job done, when really that's going to house like what, a few hundred people? What about the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that still don't have houses? No. And then the work licenses. I mean, it's just getting beyond a joke. And it's always under the guise of health and safety. But that excuse is really wearing thin now. Why does a florist need to learn about health and safety? Seriously. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I'm not a pro at this. I do this for fun. So I do this, I wouldn't even say it's for fun, it's because I feel compelled to get the word out to other people who are thinking, what the hell is going on? And I come across something and go, here's a piece of the puzzle. And you need to share it with other people and say, this is the piece of the puzzle. So this makes a little more sense. Life is getting a bit more, we're starting to identify the problems. Because let's face it, we're getting zero help from the older generation. Anyway, if you like the video, please subscribe, or click like and subscribe, and the usual things that they always say, you know. Yeah, thank you for watching.